The sun was high in the sky, shining down on the dry land like a heavy weight. The heat pressed on everything, the ground, the trees, and the small wooden houses that stood at the edge of the marketplace. The air was filled with dust, lifted by a light wind that carried the sound of footsteps, wagon wheels, and quiet conversations. It was a normal afternoon in the town, but for one woman standing near the edge of the street, it was a day that felt heavier than all the rest. She was an elderly Apache woman, small in size but strong in the way she held herself. Her long black hair, streaked with gray, was tied loosely behind her neck. Her face carried the lines of many years, lines that told a story of both strength and pain. She wore a thin, faded shawl around her shoulders, and an old dress that had once been bright in color but was now almost the same dusty brown as the ground beneath her feet. She was barefoot, her toes pressing lightly into the warm earth as if it was the only thing still holding her up. She stood near the wooden fence that marked the start of the market square. People passed her as they went about their daily work, carrying baskets of corn, sacks of grain, tools, and sometimes nothing at all. She did not speak loudly. Her voice was a soft whisper, almost lost in the wind. But for those who walked close enough to hear, she said the same thing over and over. "Don't spend money on me." There was no anger in her voice, no demand, only quiet pleading. It was the sound of someone who had lost hope, but still had enough strength left to care more about others than herself. A group of children ran past her, chasing each other and laughing. A few adults glanced at her, then quickly turned their eyes away. Some pretended not to see her at all. In a place where everyone was struggling in their own way, kindness was often the first thing to disappear. People saved their money for food, clothes, or medicine. They told themselves they could not afford to help anyone else. The woman didn't reach out to stop anyone. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there like a tree that had weathered many storms. But inside, her heart was trembling. She had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Her legs ached. Her throat was dry. Still, she whispered, "Don't spend money on me." At the other end of the market, a man named Samuel walked slowly toward the shops. Samuel was a farmer, and everyone in the town knew it. Not because he was rich or powerful, but because he had worked the same small piece of land for most of his life. His clothes were simple, a faded cotton shirt, rough trousers, and old boots with cracks near the heel. His hat, once a deep brown, was now bleached almost white from the sun. Samuel was not young anymore, but he was not old either. His face was lined from years of work under the open sky. He had strong hands, the kind that come from holding a plow more often than a pen. His back was slightly bent from carrying too many heavy loads over too many seasons. In his hand, Samuel held 3 small coins. He turned them over in his palm again and again as he walked. These were all the coins he had left. He had been saving them to buy bread and a bit of dried meat. His farm had not given him much that year. The rains had been light and the soil had grown tired. He had worked harder than ever, but the land had given him little in return. Now every coin mattered. As he approached the first shop, his eyes caught the figure of the Apache woman standing at the fence. He slowed his steps without realizing it. Something about the way she stood, quiet, still, and tired, pulled at his heart. Samuel was not a man who had much to give. He had known hunger. He had known nights when the wind blew through broken windows, and the fire burned too low to keep warm. He had known the heavy silence of loneliness, the kind that filled a house like fog. So when he looked at the woman, something inside him recognized that silence in her eyes. He walked closer. She did not look up at him at first. Her head was lowered slightly, her hands clutching the ends of her shawl. He could see the tremor in her fingers, a small, quiet shaking that told a story words could not. "Don't spend money on me," she whispered again, her voice almost too soft to hear. Samuel stopped a few feet away. The marketplace moved around them. Merchants calling out prices, children laughing, wagons creaking. But in that small space between them, there was only quiet. He looked down at the coins in his hand, 3 little pieces of metal. To some, they were nothing. To him, they were everything he had left. The woman finally raised her eyes. They were dark and deep like the earth after rain. She did not ask for help. She only looked at him, tired but still proud. There was no begging in her gaze. Only the kind of sadness that comes when someone has already given up on expecting kindness. Samuel thought of the nights he had gone to bed hungry. He thought of the times he had stood in this same market, hoping someone might offer a fair price for his corn. He thought of his late wife, who used to tell him that kindness given is never truly lost. It always finds a way to return. The woman lowered her head again as if to protect herself from the weight of disappointment. But Samuel did not walk away. He took a slow breath, then another. He looked once more at his coins, then at her. He remembered the day years ago when a stranger had given him a loaf of bread on a cold winter night. He had been too proud to ask, too ashamed to beg, but the stranger had placed it in his hands anyway. It had saved him from hunger that night. And even though the stranger's face had faded in his memory, the feeling had not. Samuel took one more step forward. He didn't speak. He didn't make a speech about kindness or hardship. He simply extended his hand and opened his palm. The single shiniest coin among the three lay there, catching a little bit of sunlight. The woman's eyes widened slightly, not in excitement but in disbelief. She shook her head slowly, stepping back a little. "No," she whispered, "and keep it. Don't spend money on me." Her words were filled with quiet pain, as if she couldn't bear the thought of taking something from someone who had nothing. But Samuel gently took her hand, the way a father might hold the hand of a frightened child, and placed the coin into her palm. His hand was warm and steady. Hers was cold and trembling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The coin sat between their hands like a bridge, a tiny, fragile connection between two lives that had both known hardship in their own ways. Tears filled the woman's eyes. She pressed the coin back toward him, but Samuel shook his head. "It's yours now," he said softly. "I've known hunger too." Those simple words were heavier than gold. They carried the weight of his own story, his own nights without food, his own memories of kindness. And in that moment, the woman understood. This was not charity. This was one soul recognizing another. She held the coin tightly now, her fingers closing around it like it was a precious stone. Her lips trembled, but no words came. The tears slipped down her cheeks and disappeared into the dust below. People around them kept walking, but a few slowed their pace, watching from a distance. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know the hunger in either of their lives. But something about the scene made them quiet for a moment. Samuel stepped back slowly. He no longer held the coin. It was gone from his hand, but strangely, he did not feel poor. In fact, a warmth grew in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was not the warmth of a full stomach or a heavy purse. It was the warmth of having done something right. The woman wiped her tears with the edge of her shawl, but she kept holding the coin close to her chest. She whispered something softly in her language, something Samuel could not understand, but he felt its meaning anyway. It was a prayer, a thank you, a wish that kindness would follow him wherever he went. The wind shifted slightly, lifting a small cloud of dust into the air. The sun was still hot, the town still busy, the problems of the world still heavy. But in that small moment, something had changed. Not in the world, but in two hearts. Samuel turned and began to walk toward the bread shop. He no longer had enough to buy the loaf he wanted, but he didn't mind. He knew the feeling of hunger, yes, but he also knew the feeling of giving, and sometimes that was stronger. Behind him, the Apache woman stood a little straighter. Her shoulders lifted. Her eyes, though still wet, shone with a faint light that hadn't been there before. She was still hungry. She was still tired. But she was no longer invisible. The coin in her hand was not just metal. It was proof that kindness still existed, even in hard times, even among strangers. And for both of them, this moment would stay alive long after the dust of that hot afternoon settled. Samuel walked away from the woman slowly, his step steady but quiet. He could still feel the warmth of the coin in his hand. Even though it was no longer there, it had been such a small thing, a single coin, yet it had carried the weight of his heart. As he reached the bakery, he looked at the two coins that remained in his palm. They were light, almost too light, but something inside him felt strangely full. The smell of freshly baked bread floated out from the open window of the bakery. It was warm, rich, and soft, filling the air with comfort. Samuel stopped at the doorway. He had just enough to buy a small piece of bread, not the loaf he had planned to take home. But instead of feeling disappointed, he felt calm. He knew in his heart he had made the right choice. The baker, a kind woman with round cheeks and flour dusting her apron, looked up and smiled at him. She had known Samuel for years. He was one of those quiet men who didn't speak much but always greeted others with a polite nod. She noticed the 2 coins in his hand and the tired but gentle look on his face. "You're late today," she said kindly. "The bread's still warm," Samuel nodded. "I was helping someone," he replied softly. The baker didn't ask questions. Instead, she took a small loaf from the shelf, bigger than the one he could afford, and placed it in a paper wrapping. When Samuel handed her his coins, she looked at them, then looked back at him. A quiet smile spread across her face. She returned 1 coin to him. "Take it," she said. "Some days are meant for kindness." Samuel's eyes widened a little. "I can't, you can," she said gently. "And you will. You've helped more than you think today." He didn't know how she had guessed, but he felt the warmth of her kindness just the same. He accepted the bread and the single coin, thanked her, and stepped out into the sunlight again. As he walked through the street, the world felt softer. The sun wasn't as harsh, and the dust didn't sting his eyes as much. He carried the bread under his arm, but it wasn't just bread anymore. It was a quiet reminder that kindness never stops with one person. It travels like the wind. At the far end of the market, the Apache woman still stood near the fence. But now she was not alone. A few townsfolk had begun to notice her. An old man had given her a small cup of water. A woman had handed her a piece of cloth to wrap around her shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was something, and all of it had begun with 1 coin, 1 quiet act of care. She still held the coin Samuel had given her in her hand, her fingers wrapped around it tightly. It wasn't the value of the coin that mattered. It was the feeling behind it. For a long time, she had believed that the world had forgotten about people like her, that no one saw her. But now she knew someone had. Someone who didn't have much to give had still chosen to give. Samuel didn't stop to talk to her again. He simply gave her a gentle nod as he passed by. She met his eyes, and in that moment there were no words needed. The small smile that appeared on her face was quiet, but it held more meaning than any speech ever could. She pressed the coin to her chest and closed her eyes for a second. A single tear ran down her cheek, not of sorrow but of quiet gratitude. As the day went on, Samuel returned to his small farmhouse at the edge of town. It was a simple place, just a single-room wooden house with a roof that sometimes leaked when the rain was too heavy. The fields behind it stretched out into the distance, brown and tired from the long dry season. Yet to Samuel it was home. It had held his laughter, his memories, and his losses. He sat at the small wooden table by the window and placed the bread in front of him. He tore a piece off slowly and ate it with quiet thankfulness. It was not a feast, but it was enough. And more than the food, it was the feeling that he had done something that mattered. That night, as the sun went down and the stars began to appear, Samuel sat outside his home. The sky stretched wide above him, painted in soft shades of orange and pink fading into deep blue. The air was cool now, and the wind carried the distant sounds of the town settling down for the night. He thought about the woman, about her tired eyes, her trembling hands, her whisper, "Don't spend money on me." And he thought about how such a small moment had changed something inside him. He remembered his late wife's words, spoken many years ago. Kindness is never lost. It always finds its way home. He had not truly understood it then, but now sitting alone under the stars, he felt it in his bones. The next morning came with a soft light spreading over the fields. Samuel woke early, as he always did, and went outside to check the soil. It was still dry, but the air smelled different. He couldn't explain why, but it gave him hope. As he worked, he heard the distant sound of a wagon approaching. When he looked up, he saw a man from the market, a merchant who sold tools and food. The merchant waved to him as he stopped the wagon near the fence. "Morning, Samuel," he called out. "I heard something yesterday." Samuel brushed the dust off his hands. "Heard what?" The merchant climbed down from the wagon. "Heard what you did for the Apache woman. Some folks were talking about it at the tavern last night. Not many people would give their last coin like that." Samuel felt his cheeks warm. "It wasn't much," he said quietly. The merchant shook his head. "That's just it. You gave when you had almost nothing. That's something people don't forget." He reached into the back of his wagon and pulled out a small sack of grain. "Here," he said. "I had an extra sack. It's not new, but it's good enough. Plant it. You'll get a better harvest next season." Samuel's eyes widened. "I can't take this." "You can," the merchant said firmly. "And you should. Kindness has a way of circling back. Samuel accepted the sack with both hands. It was heavy, but not as heavy as the kindness behind it. He felt something warm spread through his chest again. What he had given away yesterday had returned to him, not as a coin, but as something bigger, something alive. Later that day, when Samuel returned to the marketplace, he saw the Apache woman again. But this time she wasn't standing alone by the fence. She was sitting on a wooden bench near the bakery, holding a small loaf of bread. Someone had given it to her. Her hair was tied neatly now, and the cloth around her shoulders was cleaner. Her eyes, though still tired, carried a gentle light. When she saw Samuel, she stood slowly and walked toward him. She didn't speak much, she didn't need to. She took the coin from her shawl and held it up between them. "I kept it," she said softly. "Not to spend. To remember." Samuel smiled, his heart soft. "You don't have to remember me," he said kindly. "I will," she whispered, "because you saw me." Those words sank deep into Samuel's heart. He had not done it to be remembered. He had done it because he understood, and yet knowing that it had meant so much to her made the world feel a little brighter. The next weeks passed slowly. Samuel planted the grain the merchant had given him. The rains came, not heavy but steady enough to bring life back to the dry soil. Green shoots began to rise from the ground, small at first, then stronger with each sunrise. Samuel worked hard, but he did so with a new kind of hope. In town, people began to change too. The story of the poor farmer and the Apache woman spread quietly, not through loud words but through warm whispers. A man who had little had given something away, and in doing so had reminded everyone of what kindness could do. It was not about money, it was about seeing someone, about giving without expecting anything back. The Apache woman stayed in town for a while. She found small jobs helping people at the market, carrying baskets, cleaning stalls, sewing old clothes. People who had once walked past her now greeted her with soft smiles. She was no longer invisible. The single coin she had kept became her quiet reminder that even in the hardest times, someone had cared. Months later, Samuel's fields grew richer than they had in years. The harvest was full. His small house smelled of warm bread again, and his table was no longer empty. But even then, he never forgot that one hot afternoon when everything had started. Not with wealth, not with luck, but with one simple act of kindness. And somewhere in the marketplace, the Apache woman still kept that coin wrapped in her shawl. It was not worth much in silver, but to her it was worth everything. It was proof that even when the world feels cold, one kind heart can light a small fire. Sometimes people think it takes a lot to change the world, but Samuel learned that day that it only takes a moment, a quiet moment, a small act, a warm heart. And when kindness begins, it never really ends. It keeps moving from one heart to another, like a soft breeze, touching lives in ways no one can truly measure. And so, their lives, two strangers brought together by a single coin, were never quite the same again. What started as a whisper on a dusty afternoon became a story carried in the hearts of many. A story not of wealth but of kindness. A story not of power but of seeing one another when no one else does.